You know, when you talk about energy security, and that's sort of everybody's buzzword now, that's what everybody wants to use, that's what the pollsters say, you've got to talk about energy security, that's what everybody wants to talk about. But when I ask you, what does energy security mean to you? To you, it might be an affordability. To you, it might mean reliability, because you're a business owner and you've got to keep that power on 24/7. To others, it might be geopolitics. I don't want to be reliant on imported oil anymore. I see it as a national security risk. And to other people, it might be environmental risk, because they don't like the impacts of our growing energy consumption on the environment. Well, no one's right. They're all right, but there's no way to measure it. We undertook a very detailed and lengthy piece of work to actually produce the first ever index of energy security risk so that we could start measuring it. Because Washington is dominated by rhetoric. And you can twist words any way you want, but you can't fake numbers. And so we put 37 metrics and we weighted them, and we have a very detailed modeling group that put this all together. But now we have a quantitative view of what is happening to our energy sector. And we looked back 40 years and we looked out 30 years on the policy path that we're on. We can see that the worst year on record was 1980, and we are pretty close to getting back to 1980 soon. So we are not on a sustainable energy path either. We don't have the resources, we are not really doing sufficient things about demand, and we certainly have not built out our infrastructure to be able to actually improve the efficiency of our energy economy. So we'll release this index every year, but it's a way for policymakers to take a look at this index and say, well, look, we did this back in 1982. What happened to our energy security? What happened when we raised taxes on the oil and gas companies? Well, we can see what happened with that windfall profits tax, and guess what? Our energy security risk went up. Or what happened when we did the Clean Air Act? Or what happened? And we could do it with Senator Lieberman, and we did it with Senator Lieberman and Senator Kerry and Senator Graham. We said, if you pass your piece of legislation, here's what's going to happen and why. And here's what you need to be thinking about, things you need to be fixing, because there's always the law of unintended consequences prevails in these big pieces of legislation. So think it through and look how these things will actually shape up. So on the energy side, what is happening here? Well, I touched on oil and gas exploration, how much has been off limits for so long. I think we are having a very big political debate about are we or are we not going to invest more in exploration production in our country. The moratorium is in place under the Gulf. It should expire on November the 30th. But in the meantime, all shallow water drilling in the Gulf has stopped. And new drilling in Alaska has stopped and will not, because we're going into winter, will not happen this year. It will have to wait until next year. New regulations are coming out, which are going to postpone the restart of drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. And the administration has now taken off all drilling off the Atlantic coast of our country and the Pacific coast. So we're narrowing the acreage that we potentially could do. We're making it more onerous. And on the onshore parts, we have taken off tremendous tracts in Utah, Wyoming, and Montana, and probably will not see those put back on for lease anytime soon. So we really are sending a mixed message to our industry that is fighting for that 10% of the world's oil reserves. That's saying we're not sure we actually even are going to be open here at home. And oh, by the way, you have to pay taxes not only here, but also in the other places where you operate, whereas their foreign competitors do not. So we're advantaging their competitors. We're advantaging whether it's European or Asian oil companies to invest here if we're going to be open at all. And that's a very, very bad message to our industry. Nuclear. You have a huge nuclear power plant here. You understand the benefits of emissions-free nuclear power. We haven't built a new nuclear plant in this country for 30 years. But the good news is that there are a long line of applicants in front of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to build new plants. We're 20% dependent on nuclear, but those plants are going to come to their life end at some point. We need to be planning for that, and we need to be looking at the new capacity and looking at increasingly cleaner sources of energy, and nuclear fits all of that bill. However, of the 26 applications that are in front of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, none have moved forward. In our estimation, it's going to take between about 8 and 11 years for a plant to move through the process and actually come into operation. It takes China 5, it takes France 4, but us it's going to take a lot longer, is taking a lot longer. And that has a chilling effect for those applicants, but it also has a real-time money effect as well. 5 years ago, a nuclear power plant in our country cost $1.5 billion. Today, it's $7.5 billion. So the cost of capital, the cost of waiting, the cost of going through the regulatory process, the cost of commodities, everything has increased the cost. But we're doing it to ourselves. If we could streamline the permitting process, get some of these plants through the process, we would actually be creating jobs, good, high-paying jobs. Each nuclear plant in its construction employs about 2,500 workers. And then during its actual operation, 1,200 real high-paying, good jobs in communities that there are not a lot of other alternatives. You know, the support for nuclear in our country is at the highest it's ever been. Over 65% of Americans support nuclear power. It's highest in the communities in which there are existing facilities because they realize the benefits of affordable and reliable energy, high-paying jobs, and the increased security apparatus that comes with a nuclear plant that also stimulates more jobs. What's happening with coal? Well, there is not a single new application to go through the permitting process for a coal-fired power plant because nobody knows what the regulations are going to be on mercury, on sulfur dioxide, on carbon dioxide. There are 111 plants currently under construction around our country in coal, but they were proposed 5 years ago. And so they are in the build-out. Some of them actually have started to pause because they're not sure which equipment and what type of equipment to actually purchase and put on some of these critical parts of the plant because they're not sure what the EPA regulations are going to be. All the new build-outs, really, besides that, are in the natural gas area, if at all. And we talked about natural gas earlier in the previous panel. We are the Saudi Arabia of natural gas. It is a huge potential game changer, but maybe not. And going back to what the previous speaker talked about on hydraulic fracturing, if we decide that we're going to over-regulate the way we get this resource out of the ground, then it will cease to be a game changer for us. And so we need to understand the risk, but we need to be moving forward so that this huge opportunity doesn't eclipse us and we end up becoming a natural gas exporter or potentially, even worse, a natural gas importer when we're sitting on these huge reserves. So natural gas has a huge opportunity. Renewables, wind, solar. Wind and solar, I mean geothermal, biomass, but wind and solar taken together as a group comprise 1.3 to 1.6% of our country's electricity today. So double it, quintuple it, tentuple it, whatever you want to do, we're still going to need to find our 90% of our electricity from other baseload sources of power. So we can't just wave a magic wand and we're all going to be reliant on wind and solar. In fact, across the entire world, it's only 0.2% of the world's electricity is generated by wind and solar. So there's a huge opportunity for them to grow, but we have to be realistic about how much they can grow and in what time frame and in what cost. We haven't really had a very good policy on renewables in Washington. We talk a good game, but we don't really walk a good game. And that the production tax credit for wind and solar has gone on and off like a light switch every 2 years. And if you are an investor group that wants to build a wind farm, you don't really know to put that production tax credit in your business model or not, because is Washington going to give it to me or not? Biodiesel is a perfect example. Biodiesel's tax credit gets renewed every year. Well, guess what? It didn't happen this year. It still hasn't happened. It's not going to happen. And so that business model that was predicated on that biodiesel tax credit is in trouble. So Washington hasn't really been providing that certainty that business needs to make informed decisions in terms of investments. But there is no greater problem in our country than this slide. So remember meringue and remember bananas. This is my banana slide. That we can't get anything built to save our lives in this country. Now, we all know NIMBY, not in my backyard. This is banana. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. We looked at the last 3 years and looked at all of the energy projects that have been proposed across the country, and 380 of them have been stalled through environmental litigation. One would think, well, those are got to just be the dirty, nasty coal plants that nobody wants. Well, no. It actually was coal, it was nuclear, it was transmission. 40% of the projects were renewables. You can't build, you know, if we can't, one of the great projects is a big solar facility in the Mojave Desert that has been held up through a series of local and then state and now national litigations brought against this project. And if we can't build a solar array in the Mojave Desert, God help us. So we have a stranglehold on our economy. They don't want us to build anything, anywhere, anytime, near anyone. And unless we have the energy infrastructure to get the molecules or the electrons to where they need to be, we're not going to recover. But not only are we not going to recover, we're not going to be competitive, because this doesn't happen in China. China has on its books today 100 nuclear power plants. They've already built, have underway 20 of them. They have 20 more, and the rest of them are in stages of being planned. They don't wait to figure out and wait for 18 years to build a transmission line, like the transmission line that's how long it took right outside of Washington, D.C. 18 years to go through the permitting process. mean, that is not a recipe for competitiveness. And so we've got to look around and say, do we have the functioning foundation for a 21st century competitive economy, particularly in energy? And the answer is right now, no. We are succumbing to local action, we are succumbing to inaction, we are succumbing to over-regulation that is threatening our ability to compete and generate the jobs necessary to get our economy back on the feet. So in climate change, what's happening? I think Senator Lieberman probably referenced what's coming out of EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, with a series of regulations that will regulate greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act, that will, if broadly interpreted or if narrowly interpreted, depending on how you look at it, could really regulate all the way down to a very small part of our economy. You know, if you want to build a new school, you want to build a new this, new that, they could start regulating and forcing you to get permits. And I think that's not what we all envisioned, was having every single business owner to have to go through the EPA to get an authority to do something at their business. But that's where we're headed unless we have congressional action. But as he probably pointed out, and we worked with him and Senator Kerry and Senator Graham on their legislation, there really is paralysis. And I'm going to show you why, which I think is the political paralysis surrounding the issue, which is really what it is. And then, of course, we have an international paralysis as well, because without India and China coming to some sort of a global agreement with us in Europe, it doesn't work, because they are now the largest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. So we're not going to go in and commit ourselves to something only to be undercut and undone by other countries' inability to commit to something over the longer term. Waxman-Markey was a piece of legislation, the climate legislation, which passed the House of Representatives last year. It passed 219 to 212. And as they say in football, it doesn't matter, a win is a win. It was a win no matter how close. But what was interesting about that legislation is two things. First of all, it was intended to give business certainty. But in that piece of legislation, there were 400 new regulations and over 1,000 new mandates. In Washington, it takes about 18 months to promulgate a regulation. Can you imagine doing that 400 times? And you're having to wait and sort of see through those tea leaves to figure out how you can operate as a business. I don't think that's a recipe for certainty. Now, clearly they can do some of these simultaneously. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate, but it was going to be a very long, multi-year process to figure out how to implement this piece of legislation. So that's what it looked like. That was our graphics department trying to put it down on paper so that people in the Congress could actually track and see what the interplay was of these different titles. But 219 to 212, the states in red are the states whose delegations opposed the legislation, and the ones in yellow went for the legislation. So it's a much more interesting answer when you start to delve into how did this vote come about, and what does it mean, and what does it portend for future debates. So the yellow are for it, and the red are against it. And as you can see, it passed mainly because of the west coast of our country and the Northeast. And obviously they have much denser representation in the House of Representatives. But what's more interesting, and this is based on the Department of Energy's own analysis, of what states were going to lose money versus what states would actually make money off the legislation. And you can see the green states win and the red states lose. So you go back to this and how they sort of line up. It's an economic issue. When you look at the impact of that legislation on their states, legislators said this is a pocketbook issue. And I've got to really think seriously about the impact of this legislation on my state, and it broke out very differently than the way it was talked about in the media. It also broke out differently as well. It broke out by resource. Those big circles are whether you are where you have a great deal of coal produced or used. And you can see an overlay of the coal concerns in our country. Those states with the big circles were really the ones who voted against. You can see how it starts to all line up. So it's an economic issue, it's a natural resource issue, and it's very, very complicated. It's not, are we going to do the right thing on the environment or not? It's that this is a multi-tiered, multifaceted issue for people in Congress that have to look at it through a very different lens of the economy and their constituents. What would have happened if it had passed? What would have happened here in Connecticut? Well, the National Association of Manufacturers did an analysis, and they said that here in Connecticut, electricity prices would go up by 28%, and more importantly for you all that depend on natural gas, for your electricity, that natural gas prices could go up by 60% here. And that could cost Connecticut as many as 23,000 jobs.